Welcome to the Be Better broadcast, episode number 15. If you're new to the Be Better broadcast, we come at you every Monday and Thursday at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time to give you strategies and tips and techniques to help you to live an extraordinary life and achieve self-mastery. You know, we love to dive into personal development because personal development has made a significant impact in my life, and I know that it will for you too. And you know that on this broadcast, we occasionally bring on very special guests. And that's exactly what we have for you today. So all the way from Denver, Colorado, we have Mr. Ben Winter in the house. For those who don't know Ben, Ben is an author, speaker, actor, improvist, entrepreneur, traveler, father, and much, much more. He loves to explore physical places around the world, but he also loves to explore the mind. And today, Ben is here to talk with us all about expectations. What are expectations? How can we use them? How can we even eliminate them? And how can we find more peace and joy in our life? Ben, it's a pleasure to have you here, brother.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Especially all the way from Denver. It's beautiful that we can do this virtually and have, you know, all these different experts from all over the world. So thank you again for tuning in, brother. It's good to have you.
Yeah. Hey, getting up early is good for the brain. It's good for the brain.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So when you reached out to me, Ben, it struck me as very interesting because we haven't had somebody come on the show to speak about expectations, what they are, and all that jazz. So I figured we'd start right off with me asking you, what exactly are expectations and how can you remain or how can we remain conscious of them in our life?
So expectations are those things that we have of how we define life and how we think life should be. A lot of that comes from, how we grow up. So, if you grow up in a household where, every day is a wonderful day, every day is an opportunity, then that's kind of how you perceive the world moving forward in your adult life. And unfortunately, most of the expectations that we have are subconscious. We don't know that we have them. And that's kind of where I kind of came up with this whole thing, is that the only reason anybody gets upset is because an expectation goes unmet. And a lot of times when that moment happens in our lives, that's when we're first becoming aware of that expectation that we didn't even know we had. So, for me, getting upset is an awesome moment in time, a great possibility in time for you to have something different because you're newly aware of something that you might not have known about before.
So being upset can be a good thing because it can give you insight on something you didn't know before. That's what you're saying.
Exactly.
Okay. So let me ask you this. If expectations are subconscious, if we got them through the way that we grew up, through the way that we were raised, our environment, do you think it's best that we remove all expectations if we had an outcome? Or would you say it would be better to have more positive expectations? Like where should we be?
I would love to say yes, get rid of your expectations, only that's completely 100% impossible. There's people out there who are like, I just choose not to have an expectation. I'm like, well, that's an expectation. You're expecting not to have expectations. So sorry, you have expectations. It's just how it is. And, whether an expectation is positive or negative is purely in the way that you look at it. When you get upset and you take that moment to say, hey, did I even know I had this expectation? That's a great moment to say, well, no, I didn't know I had that expectation, but now that I do, does it serve me? Like, is that even something I want in my life? And then you can make a conscious choice to not have it affect you in a negative way. And in fact, turn it around for your own benefit and use it in a positive way. So it's not that expectations are positive or negative. And it's not that you can necessarily say, I'm only going to have positive expectations or I'm only going to have negative expectations. It's just, you got to become aware of them as they're happening and then choose what to do differently. And that's kind of what personal growth is. It's awareness training, becoming aware of what's happening and moving forward from there.
Okay. Very cool. So you have a book out called What to Expect When Having Expectations. Did you recently write that book?
Yeah, it's been, I don't know, a year or two at this point.
Awesome. Congratulations, man. That's huge.
Thanks.
Just for everyone listening, if you want to check out that book, there's a link in the description to grab a copy of that. And I like what you're saying about how it can be helpful to us to first be conscious of our expectations, to recognize them, and then to ask ourselves the question, okay, well, does this serve me? So let's talk about a situation where we're upset, right? Something's wrong. We know we're upset because we have that feeling in our body of, oh my God, this sucks, right? I'm going through a hard time. This negative circumstance just happened to me. Like, this person who's in this emotional state of upsetness, what can they practically do in that moment in order to take that upset and use it to serve them?
So there's a lot of things that can be done. One of the ways that I've come up with is, so I have a flow chart that I believe you've seen, where you kind of take that moment in time of being upset and you kind of work through this flow chart. And, the first question is, did you know you had this expectation? And that's a great moment in time, again, to explore, because if you didn't know you had the expectation, first of all, how can you be upset? You didn't even know you had it. So it's a great moment to just stop, look at the expectation and so on. But here's one thing I like to reference is Einstein always said you can't solve a problem at the same level it was created. And one interpretation of that is that you can't solve an emotional problem emotionally. So if you're upset, you're having an emotional issue. So there's several ways to solve that. You can solve it mentally, like the flow chart that I have. You can solve it physically by going and exercising. You can solve it spiritually by going to, whatever spiritual practice you have. And that helps you work through it. I know when I was married, a lot of times when we were upset with each other, we would get out of the house and we would go on a walk. And just through the natural progression of exercise, we were able to have a more constructive conversation about what was going on between us. So right there, it was solving it. So, I created this flow chart because I wanted something that was a quick trigger, a quick reminder that I could put on the fridge, I could put on the wall in my office, whatever it might be, so that if I ever got upset, I could just look at it and be like, oh yeah, I can do all that stuff before really, really getting upset.
So let's talk about the average person who doesn't have one of these printed out on their fridge. And obviously they can grab your flowchart and print it out, which is probably the best use of it. What can the average person do in order to take advantage of this flowchart, which I took a look at, by the way, which is awesome. It's a really simple tool, guys. You literally download it. And I mean, how can they practically use it on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. So, if you don't have the flowchart, the first thing that I always tell people is like, it's okay to get upset. And a lot of people will tell you, like, don't get upset. Society says, don't get upset, don't freak out, all that stuff. It's like, you know what? That's fine. I'm okay with people getting upset. It's just choosing not to stay there, choosing to look at it as a moment in time to say, what exactly is happening for me right now? And learning from that. That's what I want people to do. I don't want them to sit there and get upset and more upset and more upset and like dwell on it. And like a week later, they haven't resolved anything. That's not what I'm telling people to do. I'm just saying that moment in time when you get upset is a perfect growth opportunity. And if you just simply recognize that as an opportunity, that's all the average person needs to start with. And it's a practice. You have to practice that, every time you get upset, okay, there's something I can do differently right now. Start there. That's the best starting point.
So you would recommend to start with recognizing your emotion, recognizing you're upset, asking, does this emotion truly serve me? Is it helping me in my life to have this expectation that I didn't even know that I had? And let's say this is an expectation that we know we shouldn't have, right? And I've got a couple questions stemming off this. But if this is an expectation that we just finally now consciously realize, like, let's use an example of the expectation that if I hold the door open for somebody to a store, that person has to thank me, right? I know personally in the past, especially when I was younger, if I opened the door for somebody and they just kind of walked in, I would have that conscious thought of, oh, that person must be rude. They didn't even thank me for opening the door for them. And it took me until later in life to be like, okay, well, maybe that person was thinking about something else in their life. Maybe there's something going on. Maybe they're going through trouble. Maybe their way of thanking is just to say nothing at all, right? So how can we take that expectation that we don't want and eliminate it from our life?
It's a practice. The short answer is you just have to practice. Like you said, every time it happens, come up with a different scenario. One thing that I've been learning over the last few years with everything going on in society is some women don't want the door held open for them because then they feel like they owe the person something, like a thank you or a smile or something, and that triggers a whole host of things that women have to think about that I don't have to. And so if I hold the door open for a woman and she just kind of like, puts her head down and walks through and doesn't say anything, she's got stuff going on and she's got things that she's thinking about that I've never had to think about in my life. And so I have to just, like you said, consciously come up with something else. Like they're going through something, they're afraid. Who knows what it is? And maybe the person grew up being a rude person and they really are just a rude person. And is that okay? Because at the end of the day, if you did your part of holding the door open because that's how you were taught to be, a polite person, because I was the same way. You hold the door open for people. It's just called being polite. And if people don't recognize it, if they're not good with it, I have to be good with, I did what I did. I'm happy with what I did. And that's it. But it's a practice. Every time it happens, you just got to consciously be aware of what's happening and choose to do something different.
So just start being conscious of it and practice noticing it and practice reframing it in our mind to exactly what you just said. This person might not have been taught that. This person might have a different expectation themselves of what having the door open means. So now we're kind of in the realm of, I have one expectation, somebody else has a different one, which we find probably most of the time in relationships, right? The lack of communication. One person's got certain rules, another person's got other rules. Before we go specifically into that area, because I know you've got a ton of different books, and I know one of those books is relationships, and it's something we don't really talk a ton about on this show, so maybe we can dive into that a little bit. But my question before that is, what other areas of life do we tend to have the most expectations in that we might not even realize us having those expectations?
There are literally no areas of your life where you don't have expectations. So I think, honestly, relationships are probably where they're going to come up the most, though, just because when you grow up, you have an experience of a relationship or a lack of a relationship, depending on how you grew up. So you either grew up watching your parents being very affectionate towards one another, you grew up without parents being together, you grew up with a parent who's constantly dating somebody new every week, you grew up with no parents. I mean, whatever it may be, you have an experience of what a relationship, what an adult relationship looks like. If you didn't grow up with parents, maybe you saw it in the movies and you have this unrealistic expectation of, meeting and like a week later you're married because that's what happens in the movies. The fairy tale story. So that's just how we grew up. So when we finally get into that adult relationship, you have your experience, you have your expectations of how that's supposed to look, and they're coming from a completely different area, no matter what, having different expectations. And so it really comes down to what you want to dive into in a little bit. But I kind of feel like relationships, whether they're romantic or friends or whatever, is where the majority of our expectations come in, just because of how we were raised and how we grew up.
Do you find that we tend, and when I say we, I mean just people in general, do you find that we tend to recreate the way that we perceived life when we were children? Like, as an example, if we had two parents that were married, two parents that were happy, two parents that were hardworking, do you believe that we tend to recreate that experience in our own life subconsciously?
Subconsciously, for the most part. If you've ever come across a parent, they'll say at some point, I opened my mouth to talk to my kid and my mom came out or my dad came out. And it's like, I never wanted to be like my parents, but that's what happens because you're pulling off of, in a subconscious way, how you were raised. I do that with my son all the time. It's like, oh no, I don't want to do that. Nope. I'm choosing differently right now. And I think for the most part, people do imitate how they were raised, but sometimes they choose the exact opposite. So, if you're raised in a household where everything has to be perfect and everything has a place, and you just hated your childhood, you might grow up saying, screw it, I'm throwing my laundry in the corner, and that's just where it's going to sit for a day. Or, I don't want to be perfect, and I'm going to, not have a perfect household. You'll hear a lot of people who grew up in poverty, and they're like, screw that, I'm going to be rich, wealthy, famous, and etc. And we hear those stories all the time of people who are making it in the music industry and the film industry. They're like, I don't want to be poor like I was when I was raised. So they choose something opposite. But I think more often than not, we do imitate how we were raised, just because we don't have to think about it. It just naturally happens.
I absolutely love that. And I ask because I come from a family of 3 people, and I'm 3 siblings, I should say. And we're all very different. Like my parents, as an example, they've been married. They're happy together. They've been married for over 30 years now. I got married when I was 21. My brother's older than me. He isn't married, and he has, just his own relationship drama, just like a lot of people do. But then there's my sister who's with somebody, but she's not married. So it's very interesting looking at my own life and seeing, okay, well, we all grew up with the same influences. Sure, we had different friends and stuff like that, but we all had very different outcomes based on the way that we perceived and based on the own expectations we created based on what we perceived. It's just really interesting how one person can go in a different path just based on how they react to those expectations that are set.
Yeah. I mean, my brother and I are very different as well. So, but, now granted, he's 3 years older, so he had a slightly different experience of our parents. He might have seen something when he was young that I never saw or didn't understand. And I know he had a completely different high school experience than I did. So, between, and it's not just parents that shape us. It's the schools we go to, the friends we hang out with, the TV we watch, the movies we see. And so all of it, changes our perspective on life. And that's how siblings can end up so very different. So, it's the butterfly effect, if you will.
Absolutely. It's a really good point that you bring up, that because he's 10 years older, he might have seen something that I didn't. And I mean, our parents are more experienced 10 years later when raising a kid than the prior 10 years. So that's an excellent point. Before we dive into relationships specifically, because I know that that's an area we definitely have to talk about, because with fitness, your expectations are really just with yourself, right? With even finances, a lot of it's yourself, but with relationships, now you've got a duality of expectations. One person who grew up one way, another who grew up a different way, and you've got those merging together. So I definitely want to get into that for a few minutes. But a question I have for you is, you're very knowledgeable on this topic. Obviously, you're an expert in it. You talk about it all the time. You write about it. What's the story there? What led you down the path to specifically talking about this? There must be something that was a catalyst for you.
Yeah, so my background, a lot of it was personal growth, which led me to doing some improv, which was one of my absolute favorite things. It's one thing I contribute to breaking out of my shell and having more self-confidence than just personal growth work alone. And I've been doing improv with a group for over a decade, and we just have a lot of fun. And one of the things that I learned in that process, for those that don't know, there are rules to improv. And so I learned the rules pretty intricately just by doing the work. And so when I started a company called Success Improv, where I teach improv for like team building and stuff like that, one of the things I kept coming across when I was teaching it is during one of the rules, I would talk about these expectations. I would talk about, nobody gets upset unless an expectation goes unmet. And I was kind of like at this weird little point where I'm like, I speak about stuff and I have this quote. It's great because, all the great speakers have quotes that are quoted all the time. So here I am with this quote that's like great, but then I'm like, well, what do I do with it? Right? It's like I've got this problem that I've captured in a quote perfectly, but that doesn't solve anything. So that's where I came up with the flow chart, because I was like, okay, so you're upset. What do we do about it? Because it's clearly around expectations. And I was studying things. I was playing with it. I was adding things, removing things, changing things. And once I was done with the flow chart, I was like, every time somebody says no on the flow chart, like, have you shared that expectation? Well, no, I haven't shared it. Well, why haven't you shared that expectation? There's something deeper there. There's a fear of, why aren't we sharing our expectations with other people when we know about them? And so I was like, okay, I need to write a book. I need to dive deeper into all this. And so that's where the book came in. So it all stemmed from improv and teaching improv. And that's where the whole world of expectations opened up for me to speak about.
That's amazing. And how did you dive into and find so much research and information around expectations? Like what was your main strategy for researching this very deep area of knowledge?
So I used a lot of the knowledge and information I learned from personal growth and just my own experiences. And, I would talk to other people and I would say, like, does this ring true when I talk about it this way? And the more people that I would talk to, I'm like, yeah, I totally understand this. I completely get where things come from, why they happen, and so on. And, as I was writing something and putting it down, I would stop and I would question it. I would just sit there and like poke as many holes in it, around it, on it that I could come up with. And if I poked a good hole in it, then I would have to, figure out, was that just not an accurate statement, or is there more to it? Like, how do I dive into it? And so, like the statement itself, the only reason anybody gets upset. Okay, well, is that really is it because an expectation went unmet? Is that the only reason? And every time that I explore, like, here's a moment when you're upset. And was there an expectation on the other side of that equation? And I would just play with it. I would play with it. And I would play with it. And I've yet to find an example of being upset where there wasn't some expectation on the other side. Yeah. And so, if somebody comes up with it and they can prove it to me that I'm wrong, by all means, bring it my way. I'm one of the few people in the world right now that can admit when they're wrong and say, that's cool. I learned something new today. Because right now, most people don't want to be wrong and they'll fight you for it. So, but, somebody can sit there and say, no, there's no expectation on the other side of this upsetness. And I'd be like, okay, let's explore it.
Yeah.
Let's see.
And that would be grounds for another book too.
Exactly. What to expect from expectations. I was wrong.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, cool. So let's look at the world now. And by the way, a very interesting story. And it's cool that you found this while doing improv and working with teams. Like, improv's always something I've wanted to get into. And I just haven't really dived into it. I haven't really went into that world, but it's useful, I'm sure, in practically everything that you do, whether it's speaking or communication or anything. So very interesting story, man. Thanks for going into that and sharing that with us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I highly recommend anybody and everybody just go take an improv class. Find one, take it. Don't even worry about like, I'm smart enough, fast enough, funny enough. Don't even think about that, because you follow the rules of improv and they'll go over the rules of improv. You'll be just fine. Just fine.
Very cool. That makes me feel more comfortable to do it. I just took a note. I'm gonna take you up on that. I'm gonna find a class near me and I'm gonna do it. I'm always down for new things.
And then you'll have to have me back on so we can talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be great. Okay. So let's talk about the world where one person meets another person and they form a relationship. Okay. And we're not even talking about kids yet or anything like that, because I'm sure that's a whole other world. But let's say we've got these two humans with two completely different set of rules, different experiences, different references, all these things. Like, one likes to leave the toilet seat up, one likes to leave it down, right? One likes to use the dishwasher, another one doesn't like to use the dishwasher. So in this world of such, at times, especially at the beginning, conflicting expectations, because now that my wife and we've been together for almost 10 years, so I feel like a lot of our expectations are very similar because we've learned them. But let me tell you, we've never actually sat down to discuss expectations. It's never been a talking point. And my question to you is, let's say we're going into a relationship and we have this knowledge. What is one of the most valuable things we can do in order to have this conversation with our significant other? And how would you go about that?
I think as long as you both understand you have expectations that you're not even aware of, and that they're going to come up at some point, and being willing to discuss those when they do, that's it. That's all it takes, because then you're willing to communicate, you're willing to have discussions, rather than just let stuff come to a boil and explode.
Okay.
I mean, that's it. I mean, you can't plan for every expectation you don't know you have. So you just have to know expectations are coming, and we're going to have to discuss them when they come up.
And that's the perfect world, right? That's where we want to go, right? So let's say for the normal 99% of people who haven't had this conversation, like, dude, I've had a lot of, and listen, we never fight. Like, we don't have fights, but we have little disagreements, not as much anymore at the beginning because our rules were so different. What would you, I'm trying to think of the best way to explain this. So let's just say we are the normal person. We have the disagreement. One person understands these things, but the other person doesn't. How can you now have that conversation if the expectations haven't been met?
So it becomes this little fun dance. It's, some people have said when I teach an improv class, they're like, well, what if nobody else knows these rules? And I say, well, you know the rules, you understand them. So you can now trust yourself to kind of handle the situation in a more constructive way, a more positive way. Same thing with anybody who's listening right now. You now know there's unknown expectations you have in your life. So now, just from that knowledge alone, that when you get upset, that's some place to start from. You now have a tool at your disposal to take on those situations differently. So one of the examples I talk about in the book is specifically relationship. And yeah, I'm going to use gender roles, deal with it. But the wife's in the kitchen, she's making, dinner, and the guy's on the couch watching sports ball. And, she says, honey, can you take out the trash? And he says, yeah, I'll take it out. Okay. Right. Standard thing. Nobody thinks twice about it. But she had an expectation that he would get up and take it out at that moment, but he doesn't. And so she's getting more and more upset. She didn't know she had this expectation, but I mean, she knew she wanted it out right now. So she's getting more and more upset as time goes on, and eventually explodes. Like, she's angry, she's pissed off. Why haven't you taken out the trash? Blah, blah, blah. Had she said at the beginning, honey, I need you to take out the trash right now because I just put fish in there and we have guests coming over and I don't want the house to smell. Well, that's way more clear. That's way more, information to make him want to act now. And at the same time, he could come back and say, well, it's 2 minutes to halftime. Can you wait? And then you're doing what's called communicating, which I know it's hard for some people to do these days, but that's negotiating, that's communicating, that's coming up with common ground where everybody feels like they're heard, everybody feels like they're getting what they want, and all is well. At the same time, I'm not going to say she's fully responsible here, because he could have said, when do you need it taken out? Yes, I'll take it out, but when? Just a follow-up question to get clarification. So, and that's the nature of any relationship, is make sure you're clear. Be very clear with what you want. And if you're not clear on what they want, ask questions until you are. And then you can have a discussion and come up with common ground, come up with a negotiation. Toilet seat. I grew up with, if there's a woman in the house, you put the toilet seat down so that they don't, in the middle of the night, sit down on the porcelain rim and fall in, and then they're pissed off. And I don't want anybody pissed off. So it's whatever. And it was funny. Somebody posted on Facebook, is we always leave the seat down for women, but do they ever leave the seat up for guys? And I was like, that would give me heart palpitations, because if I walked in and saw the toilet seat up, I'd be like, oh God, did I forget to put it down? I would think it was my fault instead of thinking that she, was actually doing something nice for me. So I was like, no. Don't put the seat up for me. It's don't do that, because that'll freak me out. So, but that's our expectations, or that's mine, is I expect the seat to be down unless I need to use it in a different way. And that's just kind of how it is. And so, but it becomes discussions. You have to talk about it. You got to get clarification, and everybody has their part. Everybody plays their part. Everybody is responsible for getting that clarification. So somebody asks you to do something and they don't give you a why, a when, all the details around it. get clarification first.
So be specific. It sounds like based on everything you said, the number one way to even avoid this conflict in the first place is to give more details. Like, hey, take the trash out now, please, so that when the guests come over, it doesn't smell like old pizza in the house. So more specificity equals less resistance when it comes to communicating these expectations that we have.
That's funny you use the word be specific, because that's one of the rules of improv. So yes.
Oh, cool.
Be specific is very important.
Good to know. I think that's important with really communication, knowing what you want in life, how you're going to go about that, creating a plan. It sounds like being specific is just a tenet of overall life. So it makes sense that it's also involved in this world that we're talking about right now. And I guess really to bridge this to the final piece here, let's say we now have a conscious idea of expectations. Like, we know we have them, we know other people have them, and we're being conscious of them, we're noticing them, we're asking if they're serving us, we're going through your flow chart, we read the book, we get it intellectually, right? So after we practice this and do this and build that expectation muscle, what is this leading us to? What's the ultimate outcome here that we want to end up at? Yeah,
so I can speak from experience, obviously. I find I'm much more at peace with life. I'm much happier as a person. And I think that's what the ultimate goal is. You know, oftentimes I'll sit out there in traffic, and traffic is my biggest trigger still. And I absolutely hate it. I hate traffic. I hate what people do in traffic, you know, and for a long time, I would just get really, really upset in traffic. And I was like, we all took the same freaking driving exam. We all, you know, had to pass this thing to know how to drive. And you're clearly demonstrating you don't know how to drive. And, you know, I'd get upset and angry and all that stuff. So even to this day, I'll sometimes get upset. But then I have this flow chart mentally in my head, like, all the time. And I just said, you know, it's not realistic for me to have this expectation of people knowing how to drive, because clearly after this many years of driving, nothing has changed and it's only getting worse. So, you know, I take that moment. So I might be upset for 5 seconds instead of 5 minutes. And that's ultimately what it comes down to, is being upset for less time throughout life. The less we're upset, the more happy we are, the more at peace we are. And oftentimes when I find a new expectation and I get upset because it's going unmet, I don't stay upset very long, because it's now a muscle memory of like, oh, cool. Now I know about that one. No, I don't want it. Or no, I haven't communicated it. Or no, it's not reasonable. Or, you know, and the other piece is, once you know you have the expectation and you know it's reasonable and you don't want to share it with the other person involved in the scenario, you have no reason, no right to be upset at that point, because you're not willing to share it. And, you know, that's kind of the big piece, is like, unless you're willing to share it, put yourself out there, you can't be upset with the other person. You might be able to be upset with yourself for not wanting to share it. But if you consciously choose, no, I don't want to share that expectation, then you don't get to be upset, because there's no resolution there. And a lot of times we don't want to share the expectation because of fear. We're afraid of what the other person might think or say, especially in relationships when they're newer. You know, it's like, hey, I want to try this thing in bed. Well, they're just kind of like, that's not at all what I'm interested in. And now I hate you and I think you're a creepy person and now we need to break up. Like, that's the fear that some people have when they want to experience something new with the relationship. Yeah. But at the same time, what if by sharing that expectation, the other person's totally on board and now you have a better relationship?
Wow.
You know, so the fear there is what stops a lot of people from sharing those expectations. But I would say more often than not, on the other side of that fear, maybe nothing happens. Maybe nothing changes, but now you feel better because you shared. And that's a huge weight off your shoulders because you got it out there. And if nothing changes, nothing changes, but at least you shared your expectations. But if things change for the better, it was totally worth it.
What an excellent point that we can use literally everywhere. Career, relationship. If you want something but you are afraid of that end result of being told no or being shot down. I mean, usually the worst case scenario is you're told no, and now you have a reason why you're told no. And now you would understand their expectations, and you can format and adjust your approach around what you know they already expect. And maybe you have to give a little, and maybe they'll have to give a little too, but at least now you have a common interest together. That is so powerful, man, because a lot of people are afraid of hearing that no, because in their mind, that's what they personally expect. But really, like you said, we're just hurting ourselves by thinking that, because that's just our own head, right? It's not even involving the other person in their expectations.
When you go to your boss and you're asking for a raise and they say no, it starts that conversation point where you can say, what do you need for me to get the raise? What do you need to feel comfortable to give me the raise? And it, maybe it's that the company simply doesn't give raises right now because they're in financial distress and they're just like, well, we just can't. You absolutely deserve one. And as soon as things change financially, you got it. And now you know where things are. And maybe it's like, hey, I need to see this, this, and this from you before I can give you a raise. And now you have something to work for. But it creates that negotiation, that communication. And, oftentimes just by sharing, you can enter a new phase of communication so that everybody gets what they want, what they need, or they find the middle ground so everybody's happy.
That is so true. And let me tell you, I feel that I've naturally through life been a person who, if I've wanted something, sure, I always think like, what if they say no? But I've always been someone who kind of just edges into the conversation a little bit, just like what you just said, rather than saying, hey, can I get a raise? I would kind of just find a good point to bring it up in conversation or during a quarterly review or whatever it might be. And I'd say, hey, I was, wondering if maybe we could talk about my compensation structure, and maybe we can talk about how that could change based on specific performance or whatever else it is you're looking to achieve with our current focus. Like, I've always just kind of found a way to put my foot in the door just to see how the other person would react. And just like sometimes when we, as a consultant or when you're helping clients, sometimes we give a price and the price wasn't what the other person expected. And sometimes you give a price and the other person is like, oh my God, that sounds amazing. And now you're thinking, oh my God, the price could have been higher, right? Because our own expectations get in the way of that. Maybe we could ask a better question. Maybe we could ask a different question. Awesome. I absolutely love that. So before we wrap this up, because I have a couple very, very quick questions. The one question I want to ask you personally is, you have a grip on this expectations thing, right? You're conscious. You've got the flow chart in your mind. So now that you do, and obviously we're always growing, we're always improving, what brings you the most joy in your life right now?
My son does. He's 11. He's totally into lacrosse, and just watching him out there, like trying his best to do this extremely brutal sport. Like so he has practice 3 times a week, a game or 2 on the weekends. And every single time he comes home with a new bruise from getting hit with a stick or a ball, or, it's just like, man, and he still loves it. Like, he just is out there just having a blast. And so, just watching him grow up and seeing what kind of person he's becoming, it's terrifying and also very fun because, as a parent, I want to feel like I've actually succeeded as a parent, and that I did the best job that I could. And the only way to see that is to see the results of him becoming an adult. And so I think parents, they never stop thinking of like, how good of a job did I do? And, 20 years from now, when he's, getting married, having kids, maybe, I don't know if he's going to do that or not. That doesn't hinge on success as a parent. But as long as he's choosing the life he wants, then I know that like I did a good job. And, as long as he's alive, I think I did a good job. So, but it's one of those weird times, because it's like, well, he's starting to become independent. He's stopping the whole listening to what a parent has to say and more thinking of on his own. And it's like, I guess my role as a parent is coming to an end, and I'm just turning into a coach more than I am a parent.
Wow.
And just hoping that what I did and what I have been doing is going to lead him to make the best choices moving forward. Because I think that one thing, and in 5 years, I'll know the difference. In 6 years, I'll know the difference. But I've been preparing myself for that particular phase where you parent for a while and then you turn into a coach, because they know right from wrong. They know up from down. They're going to make the choices they make in high school, and they want independence at that point. So it's like, why not just let them be free? But yeah, you still have to be a parent for some things, but hopefully you've done your part. And so I'm trying my own thing as a parent, and we'll see how it turns out. You know, I might be very, very humbled by it. I might choose something different. I don't know. But that's part of the fun that I get to explore with the expectations I have about parenting a teenage child, which I've never done before. So we'll see.
Well, I'm sure you're doing a great job based on that answer, man. That's awesome. That's really cool. So let me ask you this. With you coaching him and helping him to grow up into the best man he can possibly grow up into, do you feel that the best way that you can do that is through your own example?
I think that's the only way to really do the best parenting, is by example. You know, I've seen way too many parents out there being hypocrites. One of the things I've never had to do is the whole counting thing. I've never had to say, like, stop that, you have to count till 5, etc. And the whole reason for that is that I said, you know, here's the consequence if you keep that up. And then I would follow through on that consequence. Now, there was one time I didn't want to follow through on the consequence, so I never made that threat ever again. Because I was like, if you're a parent and you make a threat, you got to be able to follow through on it. So you got to be willing to make the threat you're okay with following through on. Like the whole, you know, if you don't stop that in the back seat, I'm turning the car around. Well, you had a place you wanted to go, so turning the car around really isn't an option. But if you made that threat, you got to follow through on it. You got to turn around, go home, start that whole trip all over again. You know, so the parents that make a threat and then they have to count to 5, well, that child has been taught that nothing happens until you reach the number 5. So I have a good long time to keep doing what I'm doing. Whereas if you just follow through on the threat immediately, as soon as you make that consequence the next time, they know you're serious because you follow through every time you make that. So the parents that, you know, and it's how they were raised. That's how they know how to parent. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying they need to have the expectation that nothing's going to change until they hit 5, because that's what the child has been taught. That's what the child knows. There's no consequence until you hit that number. So, by example is the biggest thing. If you're out with your child and you're showing, you know, opening the door, you're showing being nice to people, you're demonstrating that, you know, how to be a good person out in the world, then they're going to imitate that because that's what they think the world is supposed to be. They learn by example, plain and simple. So if you tell them, like, bedtime's at 8 and then you stay up till 10, well, they might finally associate, okay, well, parents get to stay up later, but you said bed is at 8. You know, later in life, they're going to start arguing. Well, but you stay up late. Okay, well, there's a difference between adults and children, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. But, you know, if you're like, you need to eat your vegetables and then you don't eat your own vegetables at dinner, like, what is that teaching a child? Most adults don't have that issue, and I'm just using random examples that are popping into my head. But you have to understand, like, kids learn from example, not from what you say, because it's so much easier to see the situation and experience the situation than it is to verbally understand words that you're just now learning as a kid. So lead by example is really the only way to really do it as a parent. And so if you're not happy with, like, if you turn around and your kid's yelling cuss words everywhere and they're being mean to other people, you got to take a strong look at yourself and how you're acting with people and the words you're using and all that stuff. So, you know, you only have yourself as a reflection to look at.
Well said. And let me tell you, I don't have kids of my own, but if I did, I would be rewinding that entire section like 10 times and listening to that over and over, because that is just such golden advice, brother. Lead by example, let your expectations be known, and most importantly, follow through on the expectations that you set so that you can condition them to be the best version of them. Powerful. Yeah.
The other one is like, if you don't eat your vegetables, no dessert. Well, guess what? you're not having dessert either because you can't bring it. I mean, you could bring out dessert and eat it in front of them and really piss them off and show them that they're, this is what you're missing by not eating your vegetables. But at the same time, it's like, well, we were going to go get ice cream, but now we're not because we're flailing in the back seat. So now you're missing out as ice cream as an adult. And you're like, damn it, I really wanted ice cream tonight. So sometimes it's hard, but it's a very short amount of time in your life that, they have to learn those lessons. So just kind of deal with it.
Absolutely. We just covered so much. Thank you so much again, Ben. Let me ask you this. You've got a lot that you're doing. You got a lot of books, a lot of projects. Where can we follow you, and where can us listening find you after this?
I think the fastest and easiest way is to go to havingexpectations.com. You can get the free workflow. You can find my books listed on there, and probably find my social media channels and all that jazz on there too. So
that's awesome. Very cool. Guys, go to havingexpectations.com, get the flow chart. It's very easy to read, but it's easy to read, yet it's very impactful because it's easy to read. And it's something you can print out. It's something you can even put on the wallpaper of your phone, which is something that I think I'm going to do for the next week, maybe the next 2 weeks. That way, whenever you open your phone, you see it, you're reminded there's opportunities each and every day to use exactly what we've been talking about here. So that's what I'm going to do. I hope you do the same thing. If you go in the description, you can grab what to expect when having expectations. It's the link right to the Amazon posting for Ben's book. Grab it, check it out. I'm going to read it. Ben, this is awesome. Thank you again, brother, for being here, for taking your time to join us, and for sharing your insights.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.